in terms of where we are at in the hearing, first of all, my office issued an amended hearing notice on Friday, and we can, if anything came up out of that, of course, we can address those, but hopefully it memorializes what we had already discussed during our hearing. So that did come out on Friday. And my understanding today is that we will pick up with some of the remaining, I believe, we will pick up with some of the remaining witnesses for the coordinating NGO parties. I have written down Mr. Asarian and Dr. Khan. And then we would South Delta users for opening statements and presentation of your first panel of witnesses, which I have down as Mr. Wilson and I think it's Dr. Burke.
Mr. Burke as well, yeah.
Mr. Burke.
Both engineers, yes.
I promoted him. I guess I'll look first to, I'll just generally look to the room. Are there any procedural questions or corrections to what I just laid out of what our plan today should be? Mr. Reese.
Yes, no, there's no, that is the plan. I'm not sure. I wasn't remembering how long the estimates were for the two witnesses this morning. So I was trying to, based on the estimates for cross-examination for Mr. Burke and Mr. Wilson, I was just trying to get a feel for if it would make sense to hold our third witness over until tomorrow morning, so we're not lingering around this afternoon. But again, I don't remember what the estimates were for the first two witnesses this morning.
For Mr. Wilson and for Mr. Asarian and Dr. Khan?
Yes, yes.
And I think I'll look, it's probably primarily the authority who would have questions. So I'll look to Mr. Ferguson. Can you remind us of an estimate?
Yeah, I expect it'll take a couple hours. 2 hours.
Thank you. So it sounds like, Mr. Reese, tentatively, we may not get to
third witness.
The third witness this afternoon, yeah.
Yes. I guess we can reassess at lunch whether or not I need to have him available, or if we can safely say it won't be until tomorrow morning. But
I think that sounds appropriate.
Okay. And just one other thing, of course, as luck would have it, on the day that we're presenting our case in chief, I'm having a camera issue in terms of a regular camera that allows more than just my ugly face to be shown. So I may log off once Mr. Khan starts, or Mr. Assyrian, for a little bit to try to fix that, and then I'll join back. So
thank you for letting me know. We'll know that we have not lost you.
No.
You'll rejoin us. Thank you. Are there any other procedural issues we should address before I turn to Mr. Asarian and Dr. Khan? We're efficient this morning. All right, let's go ahead and I'll look to the coordinating NGO parties. Who will be presenting these witnesses? Who should I look to?
I will. So Willie.
Thank you, Ms. Willie. And I will go ahead and administer the oath. I realize we have done, we will do this again. Good morning. If you would, Mr. Asarian and Dr. Khan, if you would please come off mute, and I will ask you to raise your right hand. Mr. Asarian and Dr. Khan, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do.
Thank you very much. Welcome, and Ms. Willie, you may proceed.
Thank you. Okay. Would you both please state your name for the record?
Yes, I'm Joshua Eli Asarian.
Jacob Khan.
Thank you. And is exhibit number SCS 8 an accurate statement of your written testimony?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
And did you both prepare that written testimony?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
And is exhibit SCS 10 an accurate summary presentation of your written testimony?
Yes.
Yes.
And did you both prepare that summary presentation as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Mr. Asarian, are exhibits SCS 6 and SCS 7 accurate statements of an accurate statement of your qualifications and curriculum vitae, respectively?
Yes.
and Dr. Khan are exhibits SES 4 and SES 5, an accurate statement of qualifications and your curriculum vitae, respectively.
Yes.
And are the exhibits which were submitted with your written testimony and cited therein a true and correct copy of those documents?
Yes.
Yes.
And do you have any corrections to any of your submitted documents?
Yes, I do. It's the same. So there's one issue, and this applies to the written testimony SCS 8 as well as as well as SCS 10, the summary testimony. This is on page in the written testimony. It's page 4, paragraph 3, lines 12 through 17. In there, I had stated that the authorities' calculations of the temperature effects of how temperatures would warm as water flows from Sykes Reservoir out to the Sacramento River. I'd say that they did not include the warming that would occur in the Colusa Basin drain, and that was based on what was stated in the EIR. However, after watching the cross-examination of Dr. Sadat and Mr. Miko, I now understand that the EIR did not completely explain the analyses that were actually done, and so in fact, the canal warming was included in their calculations. And so I had said that there would be up to 4.8 degrees of warming between Sykes Reservoir and the river, and I now understand that to be 6.6 to 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, and then that also applies to the SCS 10 summary presentation slide number 4.
Okay, thank you. And we will submit those corrected versions of the testimony today and the presentation, if that's okay.
Thank you, Ms. Woolley. I appreciate that. And just Mr. Sarin, I'm sorry, I was following your words, but not in the testimony. Can you say again where in the testimony this
Page
correction applies?
4,
Yes.
paragraph 3, lines 12 through 17.
So what?
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, is that right? Oh, you know what? I'm sorry.
Okay.
That was okay. Thank you for pointing that out. I noted the wrong line number. I'd forgotten about this. Yes. So that page 4, paragraph 3, lines 12 through 17. That is another thing that my understanding evolved based on the cross-examination versus what was stated in the EIR. But that section, that was about there was a discrepancy in some pieces of the different EIR that I didn't understand. I thought numbers should be the same. They weren't the same. And the testimony or the cross-examination clarified why those differences existed. So that section on page 4, that's moot and can just be deleted. And then I'll give you the other sections. So the other section is in related to sorry, it's page 2, and it is lines 20 through 24. In paragraph 2.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
And can you tell me what the corrected testimony should say?
I have a draft of that I could read. It's kind of a long sentence. And
Well, here's my concern is that if you submit it afterwards, there will not be an opportunity for cross-exam. So I guess this is addressed to Ms. Willie. If we
Okay.
don't have it now,
Yeah,
then
I
it's
can,
not an appropriate time.
I
for
can-
cross-examination.
I think I can. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Speak. Oh.
Yes, I'm sorry. There's some crosstalk and I am not getting a clear record. If you don't have it now,
So I'll repeat and thank you for asking us to slow down. If we don't have the testimony now, there will not be an appropriate opportunity for cross-examination. So I think the options here, and for Mr. Sarian and Ms. Willie, this, I'm turning to you as well, is either to read it, if it's not too complicated, maybe that will be appropriate and we can go forward. The other option is to see if it comes in on rebuttal, but my concern is it's new testimony that we're
I
just.
think I have it, like, it's good enough that I can go with it. So I'll
Okay.
read that. So on
Right.
line 20, I'll read the corrected part of the sentence. Or let's see, it's kind of a long sentence, that's why. I'll just read the whole sentence and then I'll tell you the point at which I'll read the first half of the sentence and then I'll say the rest of the sentence should say.
Great.
Okay. So starting on line 18, the unchanged part, based on the site's release blending tool, a spreadsheet, the FEIS estimated that water released from site's reservoir at 65 degrees Fahrenheit in June and July. And I'll break there, and now I'll say what it should say. Would only warm 6.3 to 6.6 degrees Fahrenheit, parentheses, to 71.3 to 71.6 degree Fahrenheit, close parentheses, as it flows 40 miles down the concrete lined Tehama-Colusa Canal, parentheses, 40 miles times 0.12 to 0.13 degrees Fahrenheit per mile, parentheses, FEIS, page 6D10, over the course of 3 to 8 days. FEIS, page 10, or sorry, page 6D11, and the Colusa Basin Drain, parentheses, CBD, and then a new parentheses, 10.5 miles times 0.12 to 0.13 degrees Fahrenheit per mile. That's the end of the parentheses, before being discharged into the Sacramento River at Knight's Landing. So in essence, I thought the spreadsheet tool did not account for warming in the Colusa Basin Drain. I now understand that it does, and so I've updated the calculations. The key numbers being changing 4.8 degrees of warming to 6.6 to 6.3. Sorry, 6.3 to 6.6 Fahrenheit warming. Sorry, it's kind of a long, convoluted sentence.
Thank you.
So I was
And
trying to avoid
striking
reading it
the
all.
portion of the sentence but to be clear, striking the portion of the sentence that says ignoring additional warming that would occur on the 13 miles of the Colusa Basin Drain.
Yes, but then also revising the earlier part of the sentence where it says would only warm 4.8.
Yes.
Yeah.
Understood.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's clear, at least to me. And I appreciate Ms. Willie submitting the corrected version. I appreciate that. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, Ms. Mullen, if you could bring up SES 10 summary presentation, and you may proceed with your summary of your testimony.
Good morning, Hearing Officer Kinsey and others. My name is Eli Asarian. My colleague, Dr. Khan, and I are going to present this morning on water quality effects of the proposed sites project. I will be focusing on water temperature, and Dr. Khan will be focusing on harmful algal blooms. Next slide, please. So the EIR for the sites project erroneously concluded that the operation of the project would, quote, not conflict or obstruct a water quality control plan. In my testimony today, I will show that that conclusion is erroneous and that there will be violations. There's likely to be violations of the Central Valley Water Quality Control Plan, both from the diversion of water into sites reservoir, as well as the discharge of water released from sites reservoir. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the discharge effects on the Sacramento River. Most of the water is going to be released back into the river at Knight's Landing. So the EIR used the wrong threshold of significance for determining effects. They only looked at whether or not the sites project would increase temperatures in the river more than 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is a standard that's in the Central Valley Basin Plan. However, on the same page of that basin plan, there is another temperature standard that was not included in the EIR analysis. And that is that temperature shall not be increased above 68 degrees Fahrenheit in the reach from Hamilton City to the I Street Bridge in Sacramento. And that includes Knight's Landing. The EIR also ignores the basin plan's controllable factors policy, which says that controllable water quality factors are not allowed to cause further degradation of water quality in instances where other factors have already resulted in water quality objectives being exceeded. And then controllable factors are defined in part as actions that are subject to the authority of the State Water Board. And I think it's pretty clear that the decision whether or not to grant the authority the right to divert water from the Sacramento River is subject to the authority of the State Board. The Sacramento River is listed as impaired for high water temperatures under Section 303D of the Clean Water Act from Knight's Landing to Sassoon Marsh. So that reach of the river includes both Knight's Landing, where most of the site's water being released will enter, as well as some of the water from sites will be routed through the Yolo bypass. And that point where the Yolo bypass re-enters the Sacramento River, that is also listed as impaired for high water temperatures. So under this controllable factors policy, really any increase in temperature during the times of year when water quality objectives are already exceeded, that would be a violation of the basin plan. The modeling tools that were used in the EIR underestimates the effect of site's reservoir on water temperature. Next slide. And so as I'll discuss in this slide, I'll go into that in more detail. The C-equal W2 reservoir model is, the reservoir has not been constructed yet. So just a note here that the model is subject to some level of uncertainty just because it can't be validated or verified because the reservoir doesn't exist yet. That's just sort of inherent, right? I only have just one minor issue in what I saw about that reservoir model, and that was that they did not account for warming of water from the time that water is diverted from the Sacramento River to the time it would arrive at site's reservoir. But that's a relatively minor issue. The main issue with these tools is the sites releases blending tool. That is really a pretty weak and not very accurate tool. The primary reason being that nobody has collected water temperature data in these canal systems. It's really entirely reliant on assumptions. Measuring water temperature is really easy and inexpensive to do. It costs a few $100s for a probe. You can just stick it out in a water body like the canal, and it will continuously measure temperatures for many months, up to a year. And then you can download and analyze that data. Despite the millions or maybe tens of millions of dollars that have been spent on studying site's reservoir, nobody thought it was a priority to actually measure temperatures in these canals. And there was no existing data to use. So there's essentially no information on the temperature dynamics in these canals. And so what the authority did to come up with, some estimate of what temperatures might be in these canals is they assumed that the rate at which water warms as it flows down the Sacramento River would be the same rate that temperatures would warm in these canals, despite them being obviously two totally different water bodies. The Tehama-Calusa Canal is a concrete lined canal with no trees and no groundwater exchange. It's just a ditch essentially. It's not a river, and it's much smaller than the Sacramento River, much lower volumes of water. So through that spreadsheet model, they came up with predictions that temperatures would increase if water is released from site's reservoir at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the target temperature for rice. It would only warm by 6.3 to 6.6 degrees Fahrenheit by the time it reaches the Sacramento River. And as I noted in my errata at the beginning, I'm saying in the slide here it says 4.8 degrees, but really the true number in the authority's calcs is 6.3 to 6.6. I still think that that's a vast underestimate of how much warming will occur during warm months such as June and July. I think the temperatures of that water by the time it reaches the river is going to be more like 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, no one really knows because the only measured temperatures we have in this canal system is at the outlet of the Colusa Basin drain, right before, or a few miles before that water gets to the Sacramento River. Those temperatures show that temperature of that water is 80 degrees under current conditions. But we don't really know what's going to happen in those dynamics. But you know, if I were a betting man, I'm not really, but if I were, I'd be willing to bet, you know, fairly substantial sums of money at fairly long odds that the authorities' estimates of warming are too low. The authority says that under certain conditions, sites water through the Colusa Basin drain could be about 15% of the river flow at the point where the water re-enters. So if we take typical temperatures for that time of year for 70 degrees Fahrenheit for the river and assume about 80 degrees for the Colusa Basin drain and mix those two volumes of water together, we get about 71.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's about a 1.5 degree increase due to the site's releases. And that's not the 5 degrees Celsius threshold that was analyzed in the EIR, but remember, there is the 68 degree Fahrenheit temperature standard and the controllable factors policy standard that these numbers need to be evaluated against. The EIR provides a pretty strong disclaimer for the use of this tool. They say it's not actually designed to predict specific temperatures. It's only designed to be able to comparatively analyze relative differences between alternatives. In other words, the authority is admitting here that they don't have a valid calibrated tool to accurately predict the effect of sites diversions or sites discharges on the Sacramento. They don't have a tool. Next slide. So now looking at the effects of the diversions on the Sacramento River. So there's no analysis of this presented in the EIR. The EIR says that the Sacramento River temperature model does not extend downstream of Butte City, and there's still a lot of river left below Butte City. I've seen reports such as the OCAP analysis, I think it's from 2008 or 2010, that said that this model did extend all the way down to the Delta. I'm not that familiar with this model. So, but in any case, the authority provided the water board with no information about how the diversion of water to sites would affect temperatures in the Sacramento River. And so to attempt to fill that gap, I developed a statistical model using about 43 years of measured temperature data in the Sacramento River at Wilkins Slough. And Wilkins Slough is upstream of Knight's Landing. It's kind of the lower extent of after all the diversions have been taken out, but before water from sites would come back into the river. This is a daily model. It's a generalized additive model. I have a peer-reviewed publication where I've applied this model to many rivers in Northwest California. And essentially, it predicts daily water temperature as a function of day of the year, air temperature, and flow. It has an average air of about 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit. And so once I calibrated this model with the 40 years of measured data, I then applied it to predict daily temperatures for two flow scenarios. One is the observed past, and then the other is a site's diversion scenario based on the hydrology from the site's historical water availability analysis tool. Next slide. So these slides show the flow that is represented in those two scenarios. And so every dot on here is a day in the 21-year period of record that I used here. And I want to draw your attention to the month of September. So in wet years, the authority is proposing to, or says that it's asking for the right to divert water down to 5,000 CFS bypass flow. And if it's allowed to do that, it could be taking up to 46% of the river flow during that period, during some days in September. And that's going to have some effects on water temperature. Next slide, please. So these slides show the predicted temperatures under those two scenarios. And what you'll see here is that in the month of September, when the authority could be diverting, 20, 30, 40% of the river flow, temperatures are predicted to increase using my model 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is going to increase the number of days exceeding that 68-degree threshold. Next slide. So in conclusion, the EIR underestimated the effects of sites on water temperatures. It ignored the 68-degree basin plan threshold. It ignored the controllable factors policy. It ignored the effects of the diversions. It only looked at the effects of the discharges. And so it seems highly likely that unless additional permit conditions are added that govern when sites can divert and discharge water, there are likely going to be temperature impacts that are going to violate the basin plan, both from the discharge of water from sites as well as the diversion of water to sites. This concludes a summary of my testimony, and I'll pass it to Dr. Khan.
Good morning, Skunzi and others. My testimony related to harmful algal blooms and the potential effect of sites reservoir on harmful algal blooms in the system. And of course, HABs are a very important and emerging issue in the Delta. There have been many blooms that have led to cyanotoxins that can affect drinking water, recreation, water quality. Toxins can bioaccumulate in crops and wildlife. And the FEIR acknowledges that HABs are likely in sites, but in my professional opinion and review of the information, there's high uncertainty regarding the ability to control HABs in the reservoir and on downstream effects. And I think that's the crux here, is that the certainty with which these effects are dismissed in the FEIR are really where my testimony relates to. Next slide, please. So the FEIR assertions are that HABs may be controlled by management actions. Varying depths of releases would minimize downstream release. HABs released from reservoir will rapidly degrade in canals. HABs will be diluted in Sacramento River, and sites would not be a significant new source of HABs inoculum to the Delta. And I think in the next few slides show why that this may not be true with the certainty that the FEIR asserts. Next slide, please. So first of all, there's several comparisons in the EIR to some of the other reservoirs in the basin, but HABs are likely to be worse than the other Sacramento Valley reservoirs, such as Lake Shasta, Lake Oroville, where there have been a few instances of HABs, but not to a large extent. One more analogous system would be the San Luis Reservoir, which again would be filled during periods of high flow and then released later for irrigation. So those kinds of events mean that essentially without a lot of inflow, reservoirs have a chance to warm, they can become stagnant. Nutrients that were loaded during the periods of high flow can become released, and those tend to promote harmful algal blooms, which like to be have warm water, like to have high nutrients, and generally some of the species that are more problematic do well when the water is more stagnant and less mixed. And in fact, if you look at this remote sense cyano index, you can see that in San Luis Reservoir, even if you look at the 50th percentile or the median, you can see that the index is maybe about 75, where it's 0 in the other reservoirs that are in the proximity of where sites and upstream of there. For example, Lake Shasta has high inflows through much of the summer in the Cloud River. It can be tens to thousands of acre feet in a given month. Whereas with sites, of course, the inflows would be minimal to none during those summer months when cyanobacteria are expected to outcompete other species. Next slide, please. So there's a reservoir management plan, and it's essentially a list of potential actions that could be taken if HABs become an issue. But in reality, the only commitment in that plan is to monitor if visually they can find evidence of these blooms, which at times can concentrate near the surface. So while there's this list, and they're theoretically possible, there's high uncertainty about the effectiveness, specifically in Sites Reservoir. One reason for that is that many of these techniques have only really been shown to be effective in much smaller systems when they can be applied at the scale necessary to actually make a difference. And so the techniques listed were hypolimnetic oxygenation, flocculants, algicides, and physical barriers. None of these were actually modeled specifically for sites. There's lots of information and modeling that could be done to determine the sizing of these things ahead of time, what costs might be. There's, especially with hypolimnetic oxygenation, which is intended to reduce nutrients from sediments. This has been shown to be effective in some reservoirs. Rarely has it ever been used at the scale of Sites Reservoir. I've been involved with assessing many of these techniques in other systems. And in those assessments, generally, it comes out that they're just not cost effective or feasible to actually apply. Next slide. Also, the FEIR is pretty dismissive of the effect of any release of HABs from sites to downstream areas. It talks about dilution and degradation of toxins and so on, but in my experience and other systems that I've studied, downstream transport of highly toxic cyanobacterial cells can occur for many, many miles. In the Klamath River, we found it for greater than 186 miles with levels exceeding public health thresholds, as much as 186 miles downstream. There's many other examples of these even into the San Francisco Bay. And it generally, when either algal cells and algal cells associated with toxin, or sometimes toxin that may be free from algal cells, but generally it's contained in the algal cells until the cells degrade. Even in a river where there may be dilution or there may be lack of ideal growth conditions, often in edgewater areas or any kind of slack water, these cells can accumulate and exceed public health standards. The other issue is in terms of a seed source to the delta. I think the EIR states that it wouldn't be an issue because there's already a seed source. But again, what we find is that even when there's a seed source, that public health exceedances do tend to be still tied to upstream releases. And the higher the concentrations of upstream releases, the increase in the frequency of public health exceedances downstream, even when there is an existing seed source. And you can see that the distances in the Sacramento system, 57 miles to the Sacramento River Knights Landing and 88 to the upper delta, those are fewer miles than what we've seen in other systems. So given that, I think Sites Reservoir would be an artificial source of HABs not previously known to the downstream system. There's also would be a shift in the nutrient load timing. In other words, high flow, high nutrient loading occurring in the winter to the delta when conditions for HABs are not ideal would be potentially shifted to, because they'd be trapped in sites and then released during the summer months, So it would represent a potential new source of loading during the warmer, what we call kind of the algal growth season. Next slide, please. One of the concepts in the EIR is that managing withdrawal depths is key for downstream water quality. And that does have potential if you were able to find the exact depth where the HABs didn't exist. But there's a couple of issues with that. There's the balancing issue of trying to get at levels that don't contain levels of methyl mercury, warm enough for rice, which I believe is 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So both of those mean that surface is better, but algae tends to concentrate at the surface at times. At times, it actually can be found deeper in the water column. And so to balance when you need deeper water that doesn't contain HABs and cool enough for salmon versus surface water, which would be warm enough for rice and lower levels, is not clear how that would actually be achieved and whether it would be achievable in any given year. The other issue is that cyanobacteria, although they are a buoyant species and can concentrate at the surface, they can be also found at deeper levels in some reservoirs. They can be as deep as 12 meters in the Klamath River reservoirs. We have found them to exceed some of the state public health guidelines at depths of 12 meters, which in dry and critically dry years would be near or below the lowest level intakes that sites would have. Next slide. So in conclusion, FEIR does acknowledge HABs are likely in sites reservoir, but it's overly optimistic about the severity and ability to control. The many actions may be considered, but have not been modeled or evaluated for specific attributes of proposed sites reservoir. Generally, once a management technique is identified, it could take many years to implement and many more to determine effectiveness. Meanwhile, water quality may remain poor and public health at risk. So, one way to prevent that would be to avoid releases of water when they exceed the CCHAB, California Cyanobacteria Harmful Algal Bloom Network caution levels, which would be 4,000 cells per mil of a potential toxin producer, or 0.8 micrograms per liter of microcystin, which is one of the toxins, and a toxin A detection, or 1 microgram per liter of cylindrospomopsin. So that concludes my testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sarian, and thank you, Dr. Khan. With that, I believe I will turn to Mr. Ferguson. Do you have questions for this panel?
I do. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Asarian, Dr. Khan. I'm going to start with some questions for Mr. Asarian.
Morning.
Morning. Mr. Asarian, on page 3 of your testimony at lines 2 through 5, and in your presentation, you state that a more realistic June and July temperature for sites water by the time it reaches the terminus of the CBD is likely to be in the range of 75 to 80 degrees, correct?
Yes.
And by more realistic, I assume you're comparing that to the calculated temperature you'd get, or if you used 65-degree water as the release temperature and then added the warming that you spoke to in some of your corrections, correct? Which gets you to about 71.3. Is that correct?
Yeah. 71.3 to 71.6, depending on if it's June or July, but essentially, yeah. So.
And what is your basis for saying that that the temperatures would be closer to this temperature of the site's water at the terminus would be closer to 75 to 80 degrees?
Yeah, so the sites authority, used the assumption that water in the canals will warm at the same rate as water in the Sacramento River, which is has much higher flow. It's just the larger volume of water. And so you have to think about like the physics of what affects water temperature. So there's things like the depth, the width, any shading from riparian vegetation, any exchange with the groundwater. So there's a lot of different dynamics. And you know, the Sacramento River is just one water body with which warming rates could be calculated. I did some like real quick I didn't include them in my testimony because I didn't have time to finalize them, but I did some kind of real quick, you know, spent maybe an hour looking at other dam releases rivers around the Central Valley of California. So American River, Feather River, Stanislaus River, McCallum River, that have lower flows that are more similar to what the flows in the canals would be. And many of them, you know, have very cold release temperatures, 50-degree water, 60-degree water, something like that. But by the time you get, and I'm kind of going off memory here, so I don't remember exactly, but you know, some number of miles downstream, obviously it's gonna vary, but let's just say on the order of, you know, 30 miles to 100 miles downstream of very cold dam release temperatures, you can get temperatures in those rivers that's, you know, around 75, 80 degrees. So that was kind of one line of evidence, was my real quick calculations on the warming rates in other reservoirs around the Central Valley. I think 80 degrees is probably the upper limit. I would be really surprised if it goes over 80. And that's because the current temperatures near the bottom, near the downstream end of the Colusa Basin drain in June and July are around 80 degrees. That's the average temperature in June and July. But that Colusa Basin drain, part of that water is drainage from rice fields that, you know, really shallow, warm water, right? So that's kind of, I think that 80 is the upper end. But yeah, I mean, the river is flowing through tens of miles of canals that are, you know, lined with concrete, and have no shading from riparian vegetation. I don't know exactly how long it takes water to get through those canals, but I did find some information in EIR that said it's going to take 3 to 8 days. And so that's just based on my studies of rivers. I don't study canals, I study rivers, just like most people study temperatures. Like I noticed there's no water temperature data in the canals, right? So we have to kind of make these inferences based on rivers because nobody bothered to collect the data in the canals that would give us a good answer. It's 71 degrees is just too low for water that's been sitting around for 3 to 8 days that started at 65 degrees Celsius. I think it's just too low. So.
But you haven't provided any quantitative information so far, correct?
No, I haven't. I looked
some...
for it when I started my testimony. I was like, okay.
No, I mean, with respect to your analysis of these other river systems, you haven't had an opportunity to prepare some sort of a quantitative analysis. Is that correct?
I have not in a form that is you know, suitable for sharing yet. If there was an opportunity to do that, you know, it wouldn't take me more than half a day or a day to do that. So I could provide that potentially at later stages, but I have not polished it yet.
Okay. You mentioned on page 4 of your testimony that the assumption that water temperatures will warm linearly is incorrect.
Yes.
Because they will level off after they approach an equilibrium, correct?
Yes.
And if anything, would assuming a linear increase in temperature be result in a conservative estimate, and that it may overestimate temperatures?
No, I don't don't think so. It's, I mean, the reason that I mentioned that is that it's just the simplicity of the spreadsheet is based on linear warming rates in the Sacramento River. And it's used to predict temperatures in a totally different water body, the canals. It's just not how water temperatures, it's not how they work. They don't warm linearly.
Well,
I mean, I guess I would say one correction would be if you were to say go like 500 miles downstream, then you would be predicting temperatures of like the water would be almost boiling, right? And so I guess it's conservative if you go to really, really long distances downstream, but I think over these 50 miles or whatever, 60 miles, I don't necessarily think it's conservative. No, I think it's just not applicable, really, too simplistic.
in your opinion, is the warming of a water body related to the ambient air temperature? Let me just say, let me correct. Is the change in temperature in a water body related to the ambient air temperature?
It is related. That is one of the factors.
Okay, so would you expect that the Sacramento River and the Tehama-Calusa Canal are essentially subject to the same ambient air temperature at the same time, given their proximity, correct, to each other?
Yeah, fairly similar. They're in the same valley. Yeah.
Okay. And so in that respect, the impact or the influence that the ambient temperature might have on those two canals would be the same, or two bodies of water would be the same, right?
Yes, although that's just air temperature is just one of many factors.
Okay, so and it sounds like the other factor you think is an important difference is the Tehama-Calusa Canal being lined or concrete versus the river being unlined. Is that
So
correct?
if we look at river or water body, flowing water body heat budgets, the biggest term in the things that heat and cool that is solar radiation from the sun. That is the most powerful, and then probably air temperature, maybe that is a kind of second tier. So it's the morphology of the channel, like a really shallow channel with water flowing very slowly is gonna warm much faster per mile than a very deep fast moving channel. And I haven't done any comparisons, nor do I believe that the authority has done on, say, the average depth in the Sacramento River versus the average depth in the canals. I know that the mass of water in the canals is much lower than the mass of the water in the Sacramento River. Just like if you have if you were to take if you were to put in the refrigerator a glass of water and a 1 gallon jug of water and set them on the counter, the small volume is going to warm up much quicker.
Well, you're aware that the Tehama-Calusa Canal runs at a couple thousand CFS, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And what is your assumption for kind of what the average flow in the Sacramento River is?
Well, for example, in my testimony on figure 1, page 12, the average temperatures in like say June, looks like the June flows range from like 15,000 to 2,000 or 3,000, depending on, well, probably closer to 3. I can't quite see on this. But so
Okay.
it's
So for some time of the year, they could be similarly.
in the absolute driest possible lowest flows under the lowest flow conditions that occur, fairly extreme and rare. But remember, the warming rates are calculated not on the Sacramento River at the lowest possible flows. They're calculated on the average monthly, pooling all years together. That's what the authority did. They didn't look at high flow years versus low flow years or sunny years versus cloudy years. It's just everything all lumped together.
Yeah. So did you review the results of the authority's water temperature analyses in Appendix 62?
6D sounds familiar. I think 62. I'm just gonna bring that up real quick here so I can.
This is AHO 141.
60. You said Appendix 62.
Yeah.
62. Yes, I did look at this.
Okay. So can we bring up AHO 141, please? And then turn to PDF page 39. Mr. Asarian, on PDF pages 39 through 50, there are graphs or charts showing sites project changes in water temperature in the Sacramento River related to discharges, correct?
Yes, based on the authorities modeling.
Okay. And do you agree that the authorities' results here, and you're welcome to scan through these pages and look at the charts, but do not show a change in temperature in the Sacramento River any greater than approximately 0.6 of a degree Fahrenheit for alternative 3.
You're talking about in any month of the
In any month, any of
Yeah,
the months, yeah.
Can you say that number again?
0.6 of a degree Fahrenheit. And I believe that the charts that show changes in temperature are figures 62.81 through 62.812, which are at the bottom of each of these pages.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. I'd see different scenarios. So alternative 3 is that's kind of the main one, right? Yeah, so it looks like the max, it's a little bit higher than 0.6, but yeah, 0.65 or something. Yeah.
Okay. And just do you understand that or do you agree that a 15% CBD, or sorry, sites discharge flow relative to Sacramento River flow is a relatively high percentage? That's kind of the 90th percentile
That sounds about
ratio.
right. I didn't do any of my own analyses on that, and I don't remember. I'm just going on the authorities' representation of that, and I don't remember if it was, the highest ever on a, single month, or if it was like you say, something like the 90th percentile. But it's towards that high end. Yeah.
Okay. So the percentage will most often be less, correct?
Yes.
So I'm looking at page 6, lines 8 through 9 of your testimony, Mr. Sarian, where
Okay.
you conduct a calculation of what you believe could be the change in Sacramento River temperature related to sites discharges, correct?
Yes.
And my understanding of this calculation is that you assume that Sacramento River is 70 degrees and that it constitutes 85% of the flow at the point that CBD water is being discharged into the river, which constitutes 15% of the flow, correct?
Yes.
And assuming the CBD water is 80 degrees, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. If we use the sites project estimate of about 71.3 degrees for sites water at the end of the CBD and keep the percentage flow of this of sites water at 15%, the calculation yields about a little over 70 degrees, correct? About 70.2 degrees.
That sounds about right. I'm not doing the actual calculation, just estimating it. Yeah.
Okay. And so that would be about, well, almost a degree and a half, maybe a little over a degree less than what you're estimating there, correct?
Yes.
Okay. On page 7, Mr. Asarian, and in paragraphs 8 and 9, in support of your argument that permit conditions could limit temperature impacts of Yola bypass discharges containing sites releases to the Sacramento River at Rio Vista, you cited discussion in the EIR, EIS, comparing the maximum Yola bypass release to the lowest Sacramento River at Rio Vista flow, correct?
Yes.
Since Yolo bypass habitat flows are likely to be greatest in wet years, and Sacramento River flows at Rio Vista are likely to be lowest in critical years, would it be better to compare wet year Yolo bypass releases to wet year flows at Rio Vista in the month of highest average Yolo bypass releases?
I don't know. I haven't really looked at that issue of the exact timing.
Well, do you agree that the times at which sites water will be released from the Yolo bypass to the Sacramento River is going to be in wet years? Is more like, excuse me, do you understand that the authority's operating assumption is that sites water released from the Yolo bypass with Yolo bypass flows will occur in wet years predominantly?
I haven't really looked at the timing of that much. I thought it was governed more based on the fact that during certain times of year the canal capacity is already full with rice water. So like I think it's in August and September or something like that. So during that time of year, there's really not capacity in the Colusa Basin drain to pass the full quantity of sites water. So that I think was another reason to route water through the Yola bypass, as it effectively increases the capacity of that canal.
Yeah, I think I asked the question somewhat poorly. Let me try again. Is it your understanding that sites reservoir releases for YOLO bypass habitat flows are going to be greatest in wet years?
I have not looked at water year types in relation to when water would be released into the YOLO bypass from sites.
Well, in your testimony, correct, in paragraph 9, you cite a passage from the EIR stating as such, right?
Give me a moment to read that. Yes, I did quote that that is what the IR says, yeah.
And to support your statements at the end of paragraph 9 that there should be some sort of permit conditions, you used this comparison of maximum YOLO bypass releases to critical year flows at Rio Vista, correct?
Yes.
So I'm asking you, would it a more appropriate comparison be comparing maximum YOLO bypass habitat flows to wet year Sacramento River at Rio Vista flows to understand what the likely temperature changes might be?
I mean, it'd probably be best to run the comparison in all years. I'm literally quoting here from the analysis that was done in the EIR.
Yeah, I understand that, but you chose this analysis to advocate or to argue for a permit condition, correct?
I used it to say that yes, a permit condition, that in the absence of a permit condition, that there was a likelihood that that could occur, yeah.
Well, I would like to look at, but it sounds like you do agree that it's unlikely the greatest quantity of sites reservoir releases for the YOLO bypass would occur in a critically dry year, correct?
I think that statement that is quoted in there that says that they would be greater in wet years than during critically dry years. I think that's kind of pooling all of those water year types together, like looking at all the wet water years and looking at all the critically dry years and saying that on average, the flows are greater in the wet years than in the critically dry years. I don't think it says that it wouldn't occur in the critically dry year, or at least I haven't looked at that.
So if we were to compare YOLO bypass flows in a wet year to Sacramento River at Rio Vista flows in a wet year, would you be able to run the same calculation that you ran here to determine what the temperature differential might be in that circumstance?
Yeah, it's just a mixing thing. So you have two flows and two temperatures. You can mix them together to get the outlet, the combined temperature. Yeah, with any set of the flows and temps.
All right. Can we bring up AHO 72? And then turn to PDF page 42. So Mr. Asarian, do you understand table 520 to represent sites reservoir releases to the YOLO bypass in CFS in critical years and wet years?
Yes, it is the long-term average of the, what is it, an 80-year period or something like that for those two water year types.
Okay. And so in wet years for alternative 3, the highest flow is, it's showing it occurs in September, correct?
Yes,
and that's 392 CFS.
yes.
And so if we compare that 392 CFS to the average wet year value of Sacramento River at Rio Vista flows, we could then come up with a percentage which you could compare to the temperature differential at those two locations that's in the record, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so if we can go to AHO 124. At P, and go to PDF page 72. Mr. Asarian, have you reviewed any of these tables in
I don't know
this
if I
appendix
reviewed
before?
those specific tables, but the
Sorry,
format
please.
looks.
I'm sorry, there was a little crosstalk and I kind of lost some of that. Could I get the question and response again?
Yeah, do these tables look familiar to you, Mr. Asarian?
The format of the table looks very familiar.
That's what I meant to ask. Yeah, not the specific numbers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you understand that these tables are modeling output that show flows at Sacramento River at Rio Vista under the no action alternative and the alternative 3 for the project.
Yes.
Okay, great. So if we were to go to the middle table, and that's table 5B3, 4B, can we scroll down a little bit? What is the wet year average in September for alternative 3 for Sacramento River flow at Rio Vista?
In this table, it says 13,308.
Okay. So if we, for the first part of our calculation, if we divide 392 CFS, which was our September flow in the bypass, by 13,308 CFS, what number do we get?
Yes, I do know how to use a calculator. Let's see.
Okay.
2 divided by 13308. We get 2.9%. Let's round to the 3.
Okay. And so I'd like to look at the maximum temperature differential. And I think you looked at the same table in chapter 6 of the EIR between Sac River at Rio Vista and Yellow Bypass. So can we bring up table, I'm sorry, AHO 73? And then turn to PDF page 6. And scroll down. Mr. Asarian, do you recognize table 6.2?
Yes.
Okay, and it shows the monthly average and average daily maximum water temperatures in the Yellow Bypass and the Sacramento River at Rio Vista, correct?
Yes, the averages for this 5-6 year period. Yeah.
Okay. And so we scroll down so you can see all the September values. What is the highest differential in the September time period?
I believe it was for the daily means, it was, I think, 5.1 from above, and then it's higher for the daily maxes. I don't know which one you're asking about.
Oh, for the daily mean.
Yeah, can you just scroll up a little bit again so I can see that again? Yeah, 5.1.
But that's in August, correct?
Oh, sorry. You're right. Yes. Lisbon Weir minus Rio Vista. Sorry, it's been a while since I looked at this table, so. Okay, yeah, scroll down again, please. For September, it'd be yeah, 3.6 is the maximum monthly average differential.
Okay. So if we multiplied 3.6 by the 2.9%, what temperature differential do we get?
It would be pretty small. 3.6 times 0.03. Oh, why is that not working? Yeah. 3.6 times 0.03. It's about 0.1, about 0.13.
Okay. And in paragraph 9, you suggest that something on the order of 0.1 degrees Fahrenheit would be de minimis, correct?
Which can you say those lines again?
Yeah, page 8, line 5.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. So in paragraphs 10 through 13 of your testimony, you conducted your own analysis of the potential impact of sites diversions on Sacramento River temperatures, correct?
I would like to revisit my answer to the previous question, if that's okay.
What about, I'm
De
not sure which question you're referring to.
The de minimis.
Okay.
Just that, yes, 0.1 degrees would be de minimis. I would just point out the example that we were looking at was, you know, the long-term average of the monthly flows for the wet water year types, and you know, could be higher in a specific. There's in the 80-year period, there's a lot of, you know, wet years, and in a month there's a lot of days, and so under certain conditions, you know, it would be higher than 0.1. But yes, the average difference that we just calculated for those water year types would be 0.1. That was all I wanted to say.
Okay. So moving on, I'm going to repeat my question about paragraphs 10 through 13. You conducted your own analysis of the potential impact of sites diversions on Sacramento River temperatures, correct?
Yes.
And you used flows, excuse me, for one of the scenarios, you used flows adjusted to account for sites diversions, correct?
Yes.
And you used diversions obtained from the site's historical water availability analysis tool, is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
And my understanding, I believe you used the data from AHO 49, is that correct? To represent sites diversions?
I think let's see, did I cite, do I have a line where I cited,
Well, let me ask you, which data did you use to represent sites diversions from the Sacramento River?
It would generally the daily water availability analysis tool. Yes, AHO 49. I see it cited on I say that on the footnote on page 10, line 11.
Okay. And did you review MBK's technical memorandum that accompanies this spreadsheet at AHO 49?
Yes.
And so you're aware that the MBK memorandum states that the tool is not an operations model?
Yes.
Okay. And so isn't it correct that the historical water availability analysis tool doesn't simulate actual operations, only maximum possible diversions during an historical period?
Yes.
Is there any statement in your testimony that acknowledges that your temperature analysis relies on maximum possible diversions?
Well, let me think about that for a minute. I don't believe that I say that directly, but I do say on lines page 10, line 16 through 18, given inherent uncertainties as to what daily sites diversions would actually be, the purpose of our modeling scenarios is not to make exact predictions, but instead to provide insights into an important issue for which the water board has been provided little information by the site's authority. I don't say maximum diversions, but I just say, essentially, I mean, I needed daily flows to do this analysis, and that was the best information that I could find. I believe the operations model is only a monthly operations model, and as we could talk about it in more detail, certain months like September, it's the beginning of September for temperatures is a totally different thing than the end of September. It's kind of like summer versus fall, and so if you only look at things on a monthly basis, you lose a lot of the daily things that are happening at shorter time steps, which are important for the biology and important for the water quality standards. So I needed a daily analysis, and this was the best that I could find.
Okay. Can we bring up AHO 48, please? And then turn to PDF page 3. Mr. Asarian, I just mentioned the MBK memorandum that to some extent explains or accompanies the spreadsheet in AHO 49, correct?
Yes.
So you recognize this memorandum?
I think so. I know I looked at one MBK memo that looked sort of similar to this, but I'm a little bit confused about maybe if there was multiple versions over time. So I can't guarantee off the top of my head that this was the version that I looked at, but I think so.
Okay. So the last sentence in the first full paragraph begins with, by including the simplifying assumptions itemized below. Do you see that
Yes.
sentence? Okay. Did you review these listed assumptions?
Yes.
And did you take these assumptions into consideration in conducting your temperature analysis?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Can we scroll down a little bit? Well, taking the first bullet as an example, that essentially, well, I'll just take the first bullet as an example. Did you consider that in your analysis?
I don't know what you mean by considered. I use the data that indicate prepared.
But you understand the first bullet to be saying that these essentially reflect maximum numbers, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Would the second bullet essentially be similar in that it reflects a maximum downstream impact because it's considering a 1-to-1 reduction in delta outflow from sites diversions?
I don't think I don't know.
Okay.
I could see that one going under or over. It's not something that's in a clear direction like the first bullet.
On page, we can go take this down. On page 11 of your testimony at lines 14 through 19, you state that the Wilkins Slough bypass criteria for September allows significant diversions in September in some years, causing an increase of more than 2 degrees on some days in September and increasing the number of days that exceed 68 degrees for that reach of the Sacramento River, correct?
Yes.
Would you be able to tell us how many more days exceeded 68 degrees in your analysis in the project alternative versus the no project alternative?
Perhaps give me a minute here. I have a figure 4 on page 15. Maybe we could bring that up so other folks can look at that.
Yeah, so this is SCS 8,
Yes,
page
sorry,
15.
my testimony, yeah. Yeah, so it looks like let's see. You really want me to count these? Yeah.
Well, just a rough estimate, because yeah, looking at the graphs is all the data I had. So I was trying to get a sense from you and how many days it actually is.
Yes. I'll just make a guesstimate here of 20 to 30, something like that.
$20 to $30 days in September throughout the 20 plus
Oh,
years. Is that
I'm sorry.
correct?
Yes. And they all tend to occur in, early September. I mentioned earlier that September being a transition month where really what happens in early September is totally different than what happens in late September. It's a month of transition.
Okay. I'd like to turn to your slide presentation, Mr. Sarian. That's SCS 10, and then go to page 3, please. Mr. Asarian, I'd like to talk about your identification and use of the standard in table 3.7 of the basin plan. And you're focused on the 68-degree component of that standard, correct?
Yes.
So it says that the temperature shall not be elevated above 68 degrees in the reach from Hamilton City to the I Street Bridge during periods when temperature increases will be detrimental to the fishery, correct?
Yes.
Is it correct that your analysis simply compared temperature changes to the 68-degree threshold?
Yes.
Did you conduct any analysis of whether discharges that may increase temperatures above 68 degrees would occur during periods when temperature increases will be detrimental to the fishery?
I did not conduct any specific analyses. And I don't have a lot of knowledge about the fisheries on the time, like the life history timing of things like that on the Sacramento, but I know that on the Klamath River, the say fall run Chinook salmon start coming in late August, and the main part of the run enters the river in early or in mid-September, something like that. So I'm kind of assuming that it might be similar in the Sacramento River.
Is there a
There's
reason
downstream migration as well, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
is there a reason you didn't provide any analysis in your testimony related to this detrimental to the fishery component of this standard?
A reason, let's see. I mean, I was primarily focused just on the temperature section, or on quantifying temperature changes, and assuming that other experts would cover issues of timing. I suppose if I, had a year to work on this, it would be an interesting thing to do. But I was under deadlines. I was mostly just surprised that there was a component that was in the water quality plan that appeared to just be not even mentioned in the EIR. I would have expected to say, like, well, we think the 5 degrees C is the most appropriate thing to focus on because we don't think the 68 degree applies because of this, or we don't think the controllable factors applies because of this, but just wasn't mentioned at all. So I thought I should look at it.
Okay. But do you agree that in order for this objective to be exceeded, there needs to be evidence that those exceedances are detrimental to the fishery?
Yeah, at some level, I don't know, exactly
Okay.
what the burden of proof would be, or that type of thing, but as a general concept, yes.
Okay.
I would think that would be a good thing for the authority to have done in its environmental analysis.
Well, and I'll just say what I should have said at the beginning is, assuming that this standard applies in the first place, that's the basis on which all my questions were presented. So I didn't, by my question, just for the record, I'm not conceding that the authority thinks this standard applies, so. All right, let me take a quick minute. I think that's all the questions I have for you, Mr. Asarian.
Okay.
This is time to take a break.
Yeah, I think that is all the questions I have for you. So I'd like to move on to Dr. Khan, if
Sure.
maybe we want to
Mr.
take a quick
Ferguson?
break.
Yes, we'll go ahead and take a break. It's good timing for that. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10:43 and pick up with Dr. Khan.
All right.
before we get started again, I'll look to Ms. Medina. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
I am, thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I think I will go ahead and turn to you, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you. Morning, Dr. Khan.
Morning.
I'd like to ask you about a number of sections in your testimony, in particular, starting in paragraph 14, which concerns nutrients in part, and it also concerns your identification of San Luis Reservoir as perhaps a somewhat analogous reservoir to Sites Reservoir, correct?
Correct.
And on page 16 at line 2, you indicate that Sites is likely to be more similar to, if not worse than San Luis, correct?
Correct.
And in that statement, are you referring to, in part, perhaps nutrient conditions?
In part to nutrient conditions, but also to the timing and the lack of inflow to sites during the period when HABs would be expected to be an issue.
Okay. And San Luis Reservoir is filled with water pumped from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, correct?
Correct.
And do you agree that the concentration of nutrients in a source water for a reservoir is a good indicator of potential nutrient concentrations in the reservoir?
It's one indicator, yes.
Okay. And do you agree that nutrient concentrations at the Sacramento River, at Red Bluff, and Hamilton City would be good indicators in part of the potential nutrient concentrations in Sites Reservoir?
Yes, during the filling period.
Okay.
And not just the concentrations, but the load is also relevant. The nutrient load.
And can you just briefly explain the distinction between concentration and load?
Well, the concentration is usually measured, in some unit per volume, like milligrams per liter. And the load would be the concentration multiplied by the flow, and is usually measured in something like kilograms per day or per year or per season. So it's the amount of the material coming into a system over some period of time.
Okay. Have you, did you do any sort of comparison of the nutrient concentrations in the source water for San Luis and the source water for the Sites Reservoir?
No, we did not do an in-depth analysis, but we did look at, in terms of a comparison, we did look at nutrient concentrations in the Sacramento River.
And compare those to what?
To what would be needed in terms of loading and concentrations to a water body that would be sufficient to fuel any kind of algal blooms.
Okay. I'd like to bring up AHO 142. And this is Appendix 6E from the site's EIR EIS. And turn to PDF page 29. I've got the wrong page. Can we go to PDF page? Can we scroll down a bit? Oh, no, there we go. So on PDF pages 29 through 31, there is nutrient monitoring data for the Sacramento River and at Red Bluff and Hamilton City. Are you familiar with these results, Dr. Khan?
We did review them, yes.
Okay. So can we scroll down to the well, let me just ask. So our results presented for 4 nutrients, ammonia, nitrite and nitrate, phosphorus, and orthophosphate.
I don't remember specifically.
Can we scroll down, please? Okay. So for in figure 6E 37, Dr. Khan, do you understand that this is measurements of ammonia in the Sacramento River and Calusa Basin drain?
Yes.
And are most readings 0.02 milligrams or less for the Red Bluff and Hamilton City locations, which are represented by the blue circle and the black square?
Many of them are less than 0.02, correct?
Okay. I would like to bring up one of the documents that I sent in to the HO this morning. Well, let me just ask, Dr. Khan, are you familiar with nutrient concentrations in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, say around the export pumps?
No, not specifically.
Okay. But do you agree that the nutrient concentrations in that source water in that area would be a good indicator of the nutrient concentrations for the water that we use to fill San Luis?
I would imagine, yes.
Okay. So the document I sent in earlier this morning to the HO is titled Conceptual Models for Nutrients, and it's a Tetra Tech analysis that's cited in the EIR. And if we can turn to PDF page 145 and scroll to the bottom. Well, first of all, we may need to go back to the cover page, but Dr. Khan, are you familiar with this document?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, well, I'll represent to you that it's again, a nutrient analysis that was cited extensively in Chapter 6 of the EIR. And on PDF page 145, there's a table reflecting nutrient concentrations at key locations. And in particular, I'm focused on Banks Pumping Plant.
And just for the record, I'll interject, this will be marked sites 291.
Okay. So Dr. Khan, in this table, it indicates that ammonia concentrations at the Banks pumping plant are 0.064 milligrams per liter, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so that would be generally a higher concentration than the results we saw in the sites monitoring results for ammonia in the IR, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. But ammonia would not be the parameter I would look at in terms of what would be the main issue in terms of fueling summer blooms from water that's filling in the winter.
Okay. Well, so I expect you would look at phosphorus. Is that correct?
But look at total phosphorus, total nitrogen.
Okay. Well, let's look at those two then. So total phosphorus at the Banks pumping plant in table 5.1 here on sites 299 on PDF page 145 is 0.12 milligrams per liter, correct?
Correct.
And can we go back to AHO 142? And then scroll down to figure 6E 39. Oh, no, go back up, please. So Dr. Khan, in figure 6E 39, it reflects total phosphorus in the Sacramento River at key locations, correct?
Correct.
And would you agree that most readings are 0.2 milligrams per liter or less?
Most of them are at Red Bluff and Hamilton City.
Yeah, thank you. At Red Bluff and Hamilton City.
Those concentrations, and especially the ones occurring at the higher concentrations, would easily be sufficient in terms of loading during a winter period to fuel summer blooms that might occur later.
So you're suggesting that 0.2 milligrams per liter, that would be high enough?
Yes.
Okay.
That's higher than what we see in many systems where we have issues with harmful algal blooms. And I might add that the point of bringing up San Luis was not to say it's exactly analogous to sites, but to show that it's very different from the other reservoirs that were compared in the EIS. And in the FEIS, it clearly states that there's an expectation that halves would occur in those blooms. I think we were just kind of confirming that that was the case.
Well, yeah, but I was fair enough, but I was focused on your statement that it's likely to be similar, if not worse, than San Luis, correct? I mean, you did state that in your testimony.
Correct, and that was because of other factors in addition to nutrients, and that partly has to do with the lack of circulation, inflow, outflow dynamics, which are slightly different in San Luis.
Well, do you agree that it appears, if we compare figure 6E39 in AHO 142 to table 5.1 in sites 299, if we compare the phosphorus concentrations in those two tables, do you agree that sites would generally be filled with source water that it is similar in phosphorus concentration to the source water that fills San Luis?
In order to answer that, I would actually have to see the underlying data. There's very few data points going into figure 6E39, and I don't know how much data went into the other report. And a lot of it has to do with frequency of sampling. There's very few samples here. And what it indicates to me is that certain points, and maybe these were associated with high flow, I don't know, that concentrations could be quite high. A 0.2 was, I think, double what we saw in the pumping. It was 0.12, I think, he said. So it's really, to compare, we'd have to actually look at the frequency of samples and compare the various statistics. So that's as far as I can really go with that.
Well, is it your opinion that 0.2 is significantly higher than 0.12 when it comes to potential potential bloom formation, nutrient loading for bloom formation?
A higher concentration can definitely influence the severity of the bloom formation. But what I'm saying is, in January here, looking at this figure, there's a 0.2 and a 0.5, for example, in those couple of points, and one that's directly below, that's at Red Bluff. So those are quite high, and as high as the ones you showed me from the other report. And that's my understanding is that's a time when sites would be being filled when high flows were deficient.
But is 0.2 when it comes to is 0.2 milligrams per liter compared to 0.12 milligrams per liter of phosphorus going to make a significant difference with respect to nutrient loading, such that you would expect different results in San Luis and sites with respect to bloom formation, at least as it relates to the nutrient?
Yeah, you would expect a higher concentration to lead to a greater prevalence of and concentration of cyanobacteria.
No matter, even with a small incremental difference between the.
What's the small incremental difference you're referring to?
Well, I shouldn't use the word small. Even with the difference of 0.08 milligrams per liter, you think that's a significant difference, such that sites bloom formation could be worse than San Luis?
You mean if sites had a higher concentration than 0.08? Or
I'm talking about the difference between the two.
Still a little bit confused by your question. If you hypothetically, if you had a 0.08 in one system and doubled that to a 0.16 in another, yes, I would expect there to be differences with respect to bloom formation. Phosphorus is one of the greater controlling factors.
So on another point of comparison between sites and San Luis, you mentioned that one of the factors that could make sites worse for HABs than San Luis are the calmer bloom promoting conditions at sites, correct?
Correct.
And to support that statement, I believe you rely on SCS 50, which is a map of the average wind speeds at the two locations roughly, correct?
Correct.
So what are the estimated average wind speeds in SCS 50 for the locations of sites and San Luis reservoirs?
I would have to go back and look specifically at our testimony. I don't have those numbers at the top of my head.
Well, can we bring up SCS 50, please? So Dr. Khan, would you be able to use this map, which is in SCS 50, to provide me what the estimated average wind speed would be in the locations of Sites Reservoir and San Luis Reservoir?
Not specific numbers, no. I think it's looking at the general regions and comparing them to the colors in the wind speed index on the right-hand side.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and do that. So can we blow up the map? Much more.
What are we focusing on?
Let's first focus on the location of San Luis Reservoir. And Dr. Khan, is it correct that San Luis Reservoir is located just below the word San Jose?
I can't actually say specifically from the detail right here exactly where. We'd have to zoom in and
Okay.
point it out.
Also interject here. This is Eli Sarian. This particular wind speed analysis, I was the one who looked more carefully at this. So I don't know if you'd rather address your questions to me or to Dr.
Yeah,
Khan.
that's fine. Whoever can address the question. Is that the location of the water body there in the blue, which is just south of the word San Jose on the map? Is that San Luis Reservoir?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And what is based on the coloration around that area, if we selected, I guess, the highest color, which I think is one of the brown colors, what would that average wind speed be?
Can we scroll over and look at the legend? I don't have that document in front of me I think to the right, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, it looks like it's that. And then, sorry, can we get both on the screen? Scroll up a little bit so we can see the word San Jose and the legend at the same time. I think we're at the right zoom, but yeah, so it looks like there's some sections in there that maybe get up to 6.5.
Okay.
I believe that's.
And if we now look at sites reservoir location, the proposed location, can we blow up the map a little bit and scroll back to the left? And so I'd like to go up above the word Sacramento. And Mr. Asarian, it's a little hard to identify here, but do you understand where sites reservoir would roughly fall in this map?
Approximately, I don't have the county memorized, the county lines memorized. I believe it would be either the bright green or the first kind of I don't know what to call it. Well, it's not yellow, I don't think. I think it's the first green or the second green.
Okay, fair enough. Up in northern Colusa County there, which is that where you're looking?
I was paying attention to the big crook in the river in the Sacramento upstream of the Feather, which is Knight's Landing. So I think it's one of those two, the two of the greens.
Okay, so what's the average wind speed roughly in that
can we scroll back to the legend?
range?
Can we scroll to the legend, please? And scroll up a little bit. Yeah. Oh, sorry, the other direction.
way.
Down. Yeah, sorry. My bad.
Thank you, Ms. Muller.
Yes, thank you. I would say 4.5. Yeah, it's a little hard. The legend is kind of weird how it's on the borders, but I guess yeah, 4.5, 5, something like that. So that's a difference of, I don't know what that is. It's not just like, one color up, but it's two or three steps up.
Okay, so I think we generally are in agreement that the sites area on this map shows about 4 to 4.5 meters per second, and then San Luis Reservoir area is around 6.5 meters per second. Okay,
yeah, approximately.
so
that's about what, 50%? 30, 40, 50% difference, something like that.
So I understand from Dr. Khan's testimony that he's suggesting that the site's area would be calmer and than San Luis Reservoir, and therefore the area would be more conducive to bloom formation in the reservoir. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think I'll direct you back to Dr. Khan for the algal response to the wind speeds. I just wanted to interject
Okay.
that I've done the wind speed analysis.
Okay. Well, Mr. Asarian or Dr. Khan, do you know the wind speed at which inland waters generally start to become turbulent?
Generally, 1.5 to 2 meters per second, something like that. Maybe higher. It's a gradient. It's not, they can become turbulent and then they can become more turbulent.
Okay.
But
So are you familiar with the Beaufort wind scale?
in the past I've heard of it. I'm not directly familiar with it.
Okay. Can we bring up the other document that I sent this morning? I think it's called Beaufort scale for land.
And so we'll mark the sites 292.
Dr. Khan, do you see that well, first of all, does this look familiar to you?
No.
Okay, but you say you have looked at a wind scale like this at some point, probably.
I've studied the literature on wind mixing related to cyanobacteria blooms,
Okay.
not related it to this particular scale, no.
Okay. Well, my understanding from your testimony is that you are of the opinion that the wind speed could have an effect on mixing, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so if we were to look at the wind scale, is the category fresh breeze the first point at which we see mention of wave formation on inland waters?
According to this scale, yes. It says 19 to 24 miles per hour
Okay.
would be crested wavelets.
Okay. Do you know the conversion of miles per hour to meters per second?
Not offhand. I would have to look it up and convert it.
If I were to suggest to you that it's 0.447 miles per hour to meters per second, does that sound right?
I'd have to look it up. I don't keep those numbers in my head.
Okay. Well, I'd like to try to compare the number here of 19 to 24 miles per hour to the metrics that were used on the SCS 50, which is meters per second. And so my understanding is that the conversion factor is 0.447 miles per hour to meters per second. So if that's accurate and we were to run the calculation, then I get 8.36 meters per second if we have a 19 mile per hour wind. And the numbers that we saw on the winds, the map are both below 8.36 meters per second, correct? In terms of the locations of sites in San Luis Reservoir.
Yes, they were.
Okay.
But that's, of course, reflective of, I don't know the exact period it's reflecting, but it doesn't reflect things like the daily maximum or other such numbers. Maybe Eli can answer that, but it's a some conglomerate, obviously, because it's one map of a whole area. So it's a general comparison of locations, not specific wind conditions that might occur over the surface of a water body. And I'd also add that studying this for many, many years, it takes, maybe about 8 mile per hour wind or 2 meters per second to actually start to mix bloom material to the point where there's enough mixing that surface bloom material gets disrupted and can change the dynamic in a system.
One thing I'll add to that is I believe that map is average annual wind speed. So I think, yeah, Dr. Khan is correct that we're just using that as a general index of windiness, but I wouldn't try to say anything about thresholds based on average annual wind speed. I mean, really what we care about, right, is what's happening during the summer and early fall period when the cyanobacteria, when the harmful algal blooms are developing. And as Dr. Khan said, it's important to things like the daily maximum during those time periods. So I think really the only conclusion that we can draw from that about wind speed is that San Luis is a particularly windy location. You can see that hotspot kind of pop out on the map, whereas Sites is not a particularly windy location. It's not sort of a wind hotspot. So that, in general, San Luis is windier than Sites, which all other things being equal is, that would make it more favorable for cyanobacteria in Sites than in San Luis, at least for some periods at some times. We're not trying to make any, quantitative, let's do this much worse or something. It's just more like a directionality. The calmer it is, the better for cyanobacteria.
And again, I mean, I want to point out that the comparison to San Luis is not to say that it's apples and apples to Sites in any way. It's just to point out that there are other systems that might be managed more similarly to Sites than the ones, in Miss Huber's testimony, she mentions Shasta Lake, Lake Oroville, Folsom Lake, and concludes that, those aren't as likely to have harmful algal blooms. So it's really just, and then later on, and also in the EIS, it clearly states that Sites is likely to have. I don't think there's a disagreement there.
Okay, well, I'm just focused on your comparison of the two reservoirs, and you do indicate that the difference in wind speeds is likely to result in calmer waters at Sites reservoir location, correct?
Correct.
But from at least the evidence you cited, the map, the wind speeds are both below a level at which at least the wind scale indicates there would be a significant change in wave action in the water, correct?
According to this table, but that is not my experience and not what the literature will say about mixing of cyanobacterial blooms in reservoirs.
Okay. Yeah, I would like to go back to that. I think you made a comment that at a certain wind speed, and I can't recall what it was, you start to see mixing. Would you mind reminding me of what that was again?
Can we pull that up?
Well, I don't know if it's in your testimony. You just offered it here a few minutes ago. I think maybe you said around 4.
Yeah, and I would 8 miles per hour, 2 to 2.5 meters per second in some systems that I've studied.
Okay. Well, the Sites location is indicating 4 to 4.5 meters per second, correct? So you would expect mixing to occur there at those speeds.
Yes, you would expect some mixing to occur at those speeds.
Okay. Okay. So Sites Reservoir won't be entirely, your expectation is it wouldn't be entirely stagnant.
No, not at all. It would be intermittently stagnant depending on wind speeds, and it would mix at times as well.
Okay. So Dr. Khan, on page 18 of your testimony at lines 11 through 14,
Yes.
excuse me, yeah. So you state that diversion to sites stop on June 15th, and there was only outflow from Sites Reservoir such that there will be a concentrating effect on nutrients due to evaporation, correct?
Which line was page?
Page 18, lines 11 through 14.
Yes.
Are you aware that the authority has estimated the percent of evapo concentration in the reservoir?
I do remember seeing that there were some estimates of evapo concentration, correct?
Do you recall what those estimates were?
I do not.
Okay.
I think this is Elias area, and I think the long-term averages were something on the order of 16 to 17%, because I looked at that for my evaporation analysis. It's rough. It might be plus or minus, 1 or 2 in either direction, but something like. And obviously, it's going to vary through time because if you've got 4 very dry years in a row, there's a lot of evapo concentration. I think up to like a doubling of concentration, something like that. But then other times it's, if you have the more water you have coming in, the less evapo concentration you'll have.
Okay. So well, can we bring up, well, let me just ask Mr. Sarian, do you recall in reviewing that information what the kind of the most extreme evapo concentration would be, or the 90th percentile?
I mean, generally, I remember there was one spike on the time series that I thought went up to 200% or something, but that's just my memory. I wouldn't quote that.
Okay. Well, can we bring up Ms. Huber's testimony at sites 115 C2? And then turn to page 12. And then it lines, are we on page? Yeah, can we scroll down a bit? Mr. Sarian and Dr. Khan, do you see it lines 11 through 13? Ms. Huber indicates that a high-end value would be 23% for evapo concentration.
I do see that, but I'm looking at on page 636 of the EIR, there is a evapo concentration factor time series, and my memory was pretty good. It did peak around 240% at one point in the 1930s. I shouldn't say percent. Well, yeah, it's on a general unit scale that starts at 100 and then it goes up to 240. So that's more than doubling of concentration. So I'm not sure. That might be this figure figure 6-2A that I'm looking at. It says estimated effect of evaporation from site's reservoir on a hypothetical constituent through time as derived from calcium results. I don't know if that is the reservoir average. And what you're presenting here in Ms. Huber's testimony is maybe the release, which is different somehow. I'm not sure. Oh, that says estimate at 90. I'm looking at the screen here on line 12. It says was estimated at 23%, which is the 90th percentile of the percent evapotranspiration concentration. So that I guess that's the 90th percentile, but in that 80-year time series between was it 1922 and 2004, there was a period when it got as high as 240%.
Okay.
Or I guess not, would be 140% in increase.
But on a long-term average, it appears that the percentage is around 23% at the high end of the scale, correct?
That seems reasonable based on this graph I'm looking at, yeah.
Okay. Okay. And so to understand what this level of evapoconcentration could mean with respect to nutrient concentrations, you could multiply the anticipated source water concentration by 0.23, correct?
Not necessarily the source water, no. I think it would be the concentrations in the reservoir itself. And that would not be in the reservoir as a whole, because reservoirs, this one, it's anticipated to stratify and have distinct layers with a thermocline. And so, this was not modeled what the concentrating effect, for example, in what's called the epilimnion, which is the upper layer of the reservoir where a lot of the cyanohad productivity would be. We don't know how that would shrink or expand over time, depending on evaporation. And so it's an unknown exactly what the effect would be. So the statement that I had that it would have a concentrating effect I think is true. And you don't know what the exact effect will be.
Well, wouldn't the 23%
One
apply?
second. It seems like Officer Kinsey left. Oh, she's back.
I'm back. I did leave for a moment there. My internet went out, but so I did miss whatever happened in the last about 1 minute, maybe less. So a couple choices, Mr. Ferguson. I can read the transcript, or well, review the video would be the best way for me to do that, or we can go back. It's actually really up to you.
Yeah, I think you could probably read it, unless Miss Willie has something that she was objecting to.
No, I was just
Okay.
she had left and
Thanks. I didn't even realize
I
that.
did leave.
Okay.
I appear to be back, so thank you, and I apologize for that. Hopefully, it won't happen again.
Okay. Well, Dr. Khan, the 23% that's identified in Ms. Huber's testimony as the evapoconcentration rate at the 90th percentile, that applies to the nutrient concentrations in the reservoir, correct?
Correct.
So that percentage would be applied to whatever percent of nutrient concentration you're seeing at a given point in time in the reservoir to understand how much more concentrated it could be over a period of time, correct?
Well, I think I'd have to drill into that, but I think that's looking at the reservoir as a whole. And I think that the percentages could vary in the different layers of the reservoir because they have different volumes. So that would be my assessment of that.
Okay.
It's not equally weighted at all the depth levels.
Yeah, in fact, it says here on lines 9 and 10, sites reservoir water subject to the highest evapotranspiration concentration would not be released for water supply. So that's kind of implying that there will be more evapotranspiration concentration in that surface layer, and that's, you know, they want to release that very, very surface layer often because that's where the HABs will be. They'll be trying to release from a little bit below that.
Yeah, fair enough. Ms. Huber states though that this is the evapotranspiration concentration of water released. It was estimated to be 23%. And so that's at least an indicator of potential concentration of constituents that would be sent downstream, correct?
Yeah, I think so. That's what it's being represented as.
Dr. Khan, in this same location on page 18, at lines 13 through 17, you state that with only outflow and no inflow during the warm summer months, the reservoir will essentially become stagnant, allowing for a high degree of thermal stratification, correct?
Correct.
You then proceed to refer to this stratification as enhanced thermal stratification on line 16, correct?
Correct.
What does the word enhanced mean in this sentence?
It refers to the fact that it's not being operated like as typical reservoirs with concomitant inflows and outflows, that there would be very little to no inflow during that period.
So you're just focused on the inflow to outflow with the use of that term, enhanced.
Yes, in that sentence, yes.
And when you are considering these variables of inflow and outflow and thinking about sites, it sounds like you're comparing this to another reservoir, another type of reservoir. Is that correct? Which has a different operation.
General reservoir functions, yes.
Okay, so what other reservoir do you have in mind, or general reservoir functions are you referring to?
Well, in general, you have many reservoirs have an inflow that has cooler water. That cooler water, because of density differences with the water in the reservoir, generally have a certain mixing effect. They change the dynamics depending on the size of the reservoir. They'll change some of the thermal dynamics within the reservoir.
Okay.
The other aspect of that is something we call retention time, which is, the inflow and the outflow and how those balance the volume in the reservoir. And generally, longer retention times support cyanobacteria blooms to a greater degree than short retention times.
When it concerns cyanobacterial blooms, what is a time period that's long and what's a time period that's short when you're thinking of retention times?
It varies. I mean, it depends on whether, you're saying you're gonna be able to manage a reservoir for no blooms, then the retention time becomes relatively short, maybe on the matter of a few weeks. But there's a gradient in there in terms of how it affects the bloom. So that you can't, there's no specific number. It's anywhere from, a couple of weeks to completely managed to, longer periods of time, which would give you some gradient of bloom formation.
Okay. Do you agree that thermal stratification is not in and of itself a water quality issue?
No, it is associated with water quality dynamics within a system for many reasons that have to do with either bloom growth or temperatures or anaerobic conditions that would develop at the bottom of the reservoir, that sort of thing. But the stratification itself is a function of heating, depth, wind mixing, etc.
Okay. So you agree that thermal stratification is common in reservoirs and lakes in the summer?
Yes.
Okay. So in the remainder of your testimony, you describe what you believe are quote unquote issues associated with each of the authorities' proposed HABs mitigation measures, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And you recognize that hypolimnetic oxygenation can be effective in some systems, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you identified 2 reservoirs where hypolimnetic oxygenation systems have been successful in increasing oxygen concentrations, correct?
Correct.
That's Comanche Reservoir and Lake Casitas.
Yes.
And then you suggested since Sites Reservoir is approximately 3.5 to 6 times the volume of these reservoirs, respectively, the effectiveness of hypolimnetic oxygenation systems for the Sites Reservoir is uncertain, correct?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact words that I used, whether I said the effectiveness, maybe I used those words. I'd have to pull up the exact lines, but yes, in general, not, and I don't know if I was referring as much to the effectiveness of just to the feasibility of actually being able to implement them in a system that's that much larger.
Okay. Yeah. Can we take down this current exhibit and then bring up Dr. Khan's and Mr. Saren's testimony? That's SCS 8. And then turn to page 19. And then at lines 19 through 21, Dr. Khan, you indicate that the use of hypolimnetic oxygenation systems in the vicinity of the IO tower is unlikely to be effective because wind will cause water to move around the reservoir, circulating nutrients and HABs, correct?
Correct.
However, I'm back on page 18 at line 15. You suggest that the site's reservoir will essentially be stagnant, correct?
Yeah, and to clarify that, as I think you were getting at in your questions to me earlier, that was not referring to wind, but more to the lack of inflow occurring during that time period, that I fully expect circulation to happen in the reservoir with the wind speeds that you would have in that vicinity during the summer months, as is common with most lakes and reservoirs. Even on a daily basis, there'll be circulation if you get afternoon winds, for example.
So by use of the word stagnant, it sounded like you were referring to the lack of inflow. Is it?
Yes.
Okay. So do you agree that when the site's reservoir level is high, even if wind causes HABs to circulate in the vicinity of the IO tower, that the site's project's proposed IO tower system with multiple ports would likely provide the flexibility to withdraw water with lower concentrations of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins, which tend to congregate on the surface?
I think the potential is there to be able to do that, but it's certainly not guaranteed because of the way that buoyancy characteristics occur. Blooms can sink during periods of the day and the night. And in the analysis that I looked at, but for the levels that you would expect in dry and critically dry years, there could easily be bloom material algal toxins at levels that would be located close to those lower level intakes.
And I believe you suggested that 12 meters was a depth below the surface at which you've seen cyanobacteria. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was just one instance, and I used that because it was an article cited in the FEIS in relation to some of these management activities. So it was a citation related to Iron Gate Reservoir.
So do you agree that when site's reservoir storage volume is on the lower end, for example, maybe similar to Comanche Reservoir, around 400,000 acre feet, that the likelihood of hypolimnetic oxygenation effectively treating more of the reservoir is greater?
Without an analysis, it's really difficult to say what kind of a system, what the size would need to be in order to achieve those goals. So really, I couldn't say. I think there's always the potential if you were able to have the data and evaluate such things as the hypolimnetic oxygen deficit, for example, and how widespread that is and what energy it would take to mix that or aerate it, depending on your techniques. It's possible, but I couldn't say specifically with the numbers you gave me that it could be done.
Do you agree that when the reservoir storage is lower, the likelihood of hypolimnetic oxygenation systems effectively treating the upper thermocline and epilimnetic surface waters where buoyant HABs occur is greater?
Well, the hypolimnetic oxygen system doesn't generally impact those epilimnetic areas of the lake. It is oxygenating the lower hypolimnetic layer, and it doesn't really affect the upper layer, the epilimnion.
So on page 21 of your testimony, Dr. Khan, in your discussion of the authority's proposed use of flocculants, which such as alum, you mentioned that they are unlikely to be effective unless they are applied to the entire reservoir due to the circulation, correct?
Correct.
And so here where you mentioned circulation, is it with that same acknowledgement you mentioned a few minutes ago that you understand there will be some circulation, the reservoir won't be entirely stagnant?
Yeah, this specifically refers to, the characteristic of cyanobacteria, which again are generally have ability to control their buoyancy. They will come to the surface at times and form these surface scums that can be, quite a bit higher in one area than another. And when you have wind and so on, those concentrations can be distributed into different areas of the lake at different times. So that is referring to kind of the wind-driven circulation.
Do you agree that some areas of site's reservoir are likely to be more stagnant than other areas, just given the geography or geometry or whatever?
In general, I would imagine that, if there's what, use the fancy word morphodaphic features, mountains or hills and things like that, that you would affect the wind speed, then that could be variable throughout the reservoir, yes.
So could the use of flocculants in areas where circulation is lower and thus more conducive to bloom formation be effective in managing nutrient concentrations?
Not nutrient concentrations, no.
Well, aren't flocculants intended to address phosphorus?
Oh, sorry, yes, we're
Production?
talking about aluminum sulfate here. You could theoretically reduce a portion of them if you were able to treat a smaller area.
Okay. On page 22 at lines 3 through 15, you could scroll down. I don't think, are we on page 22? Can we scroll down, please? There we go. Yeah, so in this paragraph, paragraph 20, Dr. Khan, at lines 3 through 15, excuse me, on page 22, which is where we're at, you discussed studies that found that management of external phosphorus loading, in addition to measures to reduce internal loading, such as flocculant treatment, are important for realizing water quality improvements, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And with respect to Sites Reservoir, you state that external phosphorus loading from the Sacramento River would require flocculant treatment on a frequent basis because of that external loading, correct?
I don't see where I talk about the Sacramento River. Where is that particular sentence?
Well, excuse me. So on line 7 on page 22, it says phosphorus loads entering sites during October through June.
Can you go up a little? Yeah. Line 7, you said?
Yes.
Yeah, where I stated that the entire load would be retained in the reservoir.
Well, in line 7, you state phosphorus loads entering sites during the October through June period, correct?
Right.
And by that, are you referring to phosphorus loads entering sites from the Sacramento River during that period?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So, so at line 14, my understanding is that based on these studies, your opinion is that external phosphorus loading from these diversions from the Sacramento River would require flocculant treatment on a frequent basis. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I could qualify, I could see that could be seen as being vague. It meant a frequent basis year to year, because there would be the reset each year of nutrients entering during that winter period, not necessarily a frequent basis within a year.
Okay. So you cited here at lines 14 and 15, the AgStem Norland paper dated 2021, correct?
Correct.
And do you agree that this paper, which is SCS 57, found that lakes with high external loading had treatment longevity ranging from 7 to 21 years?
I haven't looked at it in several months, but I believe that sounds like it's correct.
So do you agree that 7 to 21 years of flocculant treatment longevity could be useful in managing nutrients in a reservoir?
Yes, it could be.
Okay.
There's a caveat though, and that is that what the flocculant does is it binds the phosphorus generally, and it settles to the bottom, and it also seals the bottom to prevent release of phosphorus that might be recycled. And the key there is recycle, because that phosphorus is recycled from external loading. So if you cap the sediment, let's say if you're effective at doing that, but then the following winter you have a completely new load that's retained, it will actually be on top of that layer and be available to be recycled as the season goes on. So that's what I'm referring to there in that paragraph in that description. Normally, if you have, sorry, go ahead.
Was it your understanding that in the reaching the conclusion that water bodies with high external loading had treatment longevity ranging from 7 to 21 years, as is presented in the paper in SCS 57, they accounted for that year-on-year external loading that you just mentioned?
I'd have to look at this specific statement and the underlying data, which at this point I can't remember exactly. I'd have to pull up that particular reference.
I'm sorry, which statement are you referring to?
The one that you said about the 7 to 10 years.
Well, can we bring up the SCS 57? And then go to page 10. And then scroll down, please. Further. So Dr. Khan, under conclusions, about midway through that paragraph, it says, on the other hand.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so that's the sentence I'm referring to.
Okay.
And so I guess my question is, do you know whether the analysis in this paper considered that phenomenon you just described where you're going to have repeat loading, or I think you said?
I don't know specifically, but I do know that it's very rare to have a system where the complete load to a system is entirely retained in a system. In other words, when you have a classic system of a natural lake or a reservoir during times of high inflow, there's usually high outflow as well. So there's a formula that you can use to see, you know, what percentage of the incoming phosphorus load is actually retained. And in this case of sites, it's essentially all of it. So you're essentially getting this entire reset. So I don't know specifically whether they evaluated that. In the following sentence says, in addition, elevated external loading will limit the positive effects of reduced internal loading.
But they still appear to reach the conclusion that there's potential longevity ranging from 7 to 21 years, correct?
That's the potential in the systems they evaluated with the characteristics that they had.
Okay. And I think you acknowledged before we jumped off, or I jumped off on a bit of a tangent, that 7 to 21 years of treatment longevity could be helpful or useful, correct, in the site's reservoir?
Correct.
So can we return to your testimony, SCS 8, please? At page 22, which is where we're at, on line 14, you used the word elevated to describe external loading there. What do you have a threshold in mind when you say elevated?
Yeah, that's a rather vague term. It just means that they're within the range that would generally be of an issue in terms of nuisance algal blooms, and that's that elevated loading. It just comes from that sentence we just looked at in the Agstam and Norland article. That was their quote.
Yeah, I think they may have used the word high concentrations. Is that correct?
Yeah, we'd have to go back and look.
Well,
elevated is there's different kinds of systems. In other words, you know, there's systems where it might be a very pristine watershed and you know, little agriculture, little erosion, etc., and those would have a lower external loading than a system that would be elevated due to being a large area that might be impacted by various activities. So it's just a general term of comparison.
well, with respect to phosphorus loading, is there a specific concentration that you consider elevated when it comes to potential production of cyanobacteria blooms?
It's a gradient, you know, and it's also the loading rate to a reservoir depends on the characteristics of the reservoir too. Like if you have a low load, you know, a very low load, but the system is very small, it could still lead to impacts. So there's a gradient. But if you have a situation of high flows along with moderate to high concentrations, then I would consider that to be an elevated external loading.
So on page, the same page at lines 16 and 17, you begin a discussion of algicides, correct?
Correct.
And you recognize that the authority's reservoir management plan proposes use of algicides, quote, on an as-needed basis as spot applications in the early phase of a bloom, correct?
Correct.
And do you understand that the authority proposes spot applications in the early phase of a bloom to avoid lysing a larger population of cyanobacteria?
I don't remember that specifically.
Would that be a reason to attempt to apply algicides in the early phase of a bloom?
I suppose it could be.
Hmm.
I don't believe that it's going to effectively prevent the bloom from increasing, given the other factors I talked about in terms of circulation and the fact that it's extremely difficult to actually get an effective treatment in a system of that size.
An effective algicide treatment? Is that what you're suggesting?
Correct.
But assuming you're able to identify
Can
a
you
bloom,
can you scroll down to the rest of the what I said around this?
Do you want, I'm sorry, Dr. Khan, do you want the next page?
Yeah, I think we're referring to my paragraph 21, and I can only see the first 1.5 lines of it, so I wanted to check on that. So go ahead. Sorry.
well, I wanted to ask you, based on your experience, do you believe application of algicides in the early phase of a bloom can effectively address the or effectively manage that bloom at least?
With repeated application and with an extensive enough program to treat wide areas of the reservoir repeatedly, it's certainly possible. My opinion is that it's not feasible.
And your opinion is it's not feasible because of the wind and subsequent circulation?
And the size of the reservoir and the rapidity with which they multiply, as well as the subsequent nutrients that are released from the dying algae, which are then available to fuel further growth.
You had previously agreed that some areas of the reservoir are likely to be more stagnant than others, correct?
It's certainly a potential, yes.
Okay, so could, similar to my question about flocculants, could algicides be effective at least in those areas in addressing management of early phase blooms?
They could be it could be effective in a small area, but it would be very unlikely to be effective reservoir wide. And I would expect, even if cells might be concentrated in one area due to being calmer conditions, that typically in systems, algae are found reservoir wide. They're growing reservoir wide. They may concentrate in a certain area as they become buoyant, and wind might blow them into a bay where there may be less wind there, but that doesn't mean they're not there. So there's almost a constant resupply of algal cells growing throughout, even in the middle of the reservoir.
But correct me if I'm wrong, isn't the overall goal to come up with a set of measures that can minimize the presence of HABs throughout the reservoir? And is that correct?
Correct.
And so by managing them in one section of the reservoir, you're at least addressing that issue of overall presence in the reservoir, correct?
Correct, but I don't know that that would be enough to prevent harmful algal bloom material or toxins from being released from the reservoir or being problematic in another area of the reservoir.
Okay.
If you were managing it for recreation and you had a cove that had a recreation site and you're able to, you know, sort of isolate that and treat it, sure, that could work in that particular area, but I do not think that it would be effective on a reservoir-wide basis, just given the dynamics of these kinds of blooms.
Okay. So on page 23, in paragraph 22, you discuss the use of physical barriers as a means to reduce the amount of surface blooms entrained in outlet structures of a reservoir, correct?
Correct.
And I believe you previously acknowledged that the proposed IO tower structure with a multi elevation system could to some extent manage the potential release of cyanobacteria, correct?
It has that potential, yes.
Okay. And in that respect, is it to some extent essentially doing the job that a physical barrier would do, such as a curtain?
If you were able to achieve that, it could.
Okay. The goal of a curtain is to ultimately take water from a lower elevation, correct?
Essentially, it's
Below the mixing zone.
yes.
Okay. So do you agree that it's likely sites would only let me start that. Well, do you agree it's likely that the sites project would only use a curtain in the event that the water elevation is lower or on the lower side?
It's not specified how they would use it. It's just listed in their reservoir management plan as one of the tools that they claim would be able to help them manage and prevent downstream release of HAB material. That was part of my point, is there is really no actual analysis of the various tools in the toolbox and whether and how effective and how they would be used and when they would be used and if they would be used.
Well, I think you acknowledged that with the IO tower, at least when the reservoir is full, has the potential to manage release of cyanobacteria by taking water from a lower level, correct?
Correct.
And so the likelihood that you would need to use a curtain at full reservoir level is probably pretty low, correct? With the current
Well, I
design
think it
specifications
depends.
of the IO
I think
tower,
it
right?
depends on some of those other factors that we talked about, like
Hey, excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, you guys talked over each other and I got,
sorry.
I had the last question. Curtain at full reservoir level is probably pretty low, correct?
I'll restate the question. Yeah, my question was the likelihood of the use of a curtain if site's reservoir is full, given the design of the IO tower is probably pretty low, correct?
Well, and my answer to that is it depends on the other factors we mentioned and the desire to get water of the right temperature and the desire to avoid methyl mercury. So theoretically, they might want to use it other times as well.
Okay. So in SCS 62, which is a pay-per-use site, in paragraph 22, there was an evaluation of the effectiveness of a physical barrier installed in Iron Gate Reservoir, correct?
Correct.
And you mentioned in your testimony Mexica et al.'s conclusion that when the curtain system was not deployed below the mixed layer depth, it did not consistently reduce cyanobacteria concentrations. And to be effective, it needs to be deployed below the mixed layer depth, correct?
Correct.
It is true that Mexica et al. Found that when the curtain was extended below the mixed layer, concentrations of cyanobacteria, microcystis, and total microcystin were statistically and significantly reduced, correct?
That was their conclusion, correct?
Okay. And cyanobacteria was reduced by 90%, is that correct?
That was, I don't remember the exact number. I'll take your word for it that that was their conclusion.
Okay. Would you agree that SCS 62 shows that if sized properly, the curtain can be effective at controlling concentrations of cyanobacteria and microcystis?
I believe that it shows that it does have potential.
Mhm.
The point of my paragraph here is stating that there was no evaluation of that to date, so there's no idea of the feasibility and the cost and all of those things. It wasn't to say that it didn't have potential.
My understanding is you reviewed the site's reservoir management plan. Is that correct?
Correct.
And do you generally understand that sites will finalize that plan prior to filling the reservoir?
Yes.
And do you understand that the reservoir plan will continue to be revised throughout operation of the reservoir to
I
account for
believe-
changes in operation?
I believe I remember reading that. Correct.
And do you agree that advances in the measures that sites has currently identified to address cyanobacteria and HABs are likely over the next 10 years prior to filling the reservoir?
I would probably disagree with that. There aren't that many tools to be able to do that. Many people have tried, so I don't know if I would agree with that.
And do you understand that at least in the reservoir management plan, sites is recognizing that if in-lake HABs management and control measures are required in the future due to recurrent blooms, that multiple measures may be required for long-term HABs management?
Yeah, I do understand that. And I think the point that I made is that these things are not very easy to do. It's easy to list the kinds of things you might do, but in practicality, it proves very challenging. In the 40 years I've been working on HABs, I found that it's extremely difficult to manage these things and to prevent downstream transport. It's not that it's not doable, it's just that it's very difficult to do.
Okay. On page 26 of your testimony, at lines 6 through 17, you mentioned that to be effective for reducing the cyanobacteria to the Colusa Basin drain, algicides would need to be applied almost daily so that the entire flow is continuously treated, correct?
Correct.
And here you're referring to algicide application in the Tamaclusa Canal. correct?
Correct.
Okay. So by suggesting the need for continuous treatment, you seem to be assuming that cyanobacteria would be continuously present in the site's discharge. Are you making that assumption?
I don't know that. I'm assuming that they would continuously be there, but that they would be there often enough. I think what I was referring to there is that if there's, even if it's during a shorter time period when there's a bloom occurring that is being discharged, that was occurring, let's say over a week's period in time, that during that week, you couldn't just treat it the first day because of the flow. You would have to treat it for whatever period it was present in there. So that to clarify that, no, it's not continuous. It's when it's present.
Okay. Jumping back to page 23, line
Mr.
20 through,
Mr. Ferguson, can we
Yeah.
do just a time check really quick? How much
Sure.
we are at 12:15, so I wanted to see what your estimate is for how much more.
yeah, excuse me. I'd say probably 20 more minutes, 20 to 30 more minutes.
I think it makes sense, and I don't know if this is a good breaking point. You can
Sure.
let me know, but I think it makes sense to pause and come back after lunch. If
Okay.
but I don't know if you want to do it now, or if you had some things you wanted to finish up.
That's fine.
Okay. So I think we can pause there. I did before we break for lunch, and I will give us a till 1:15, but I wanted to look back to Mr. Reese. I think it's fair to say my math on the cross-exam estimates for Mr. Wilson and Mr. Burke was something over 5 hours. Hopefully it'll be less than that because some of the same questions will be asked. But I think it's fair for me to say you don't need to have a third witness lined up for today.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Are there any other procedural things we should address before we break for lunch and come back at 1:15?
This is Don Mooney. We're hoping for Chairman Mitchum for November 4th, and that's our plan. Just wanted to give a heads up on that.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Hearing officer, I just got information that further to the email I sent out last week, Joe Ratto will not be able to testify Wednesday because of a health issue and a procedure he has to have. So we are thinking, targeting him for November 4th.
Okay. We may have a big day on November 4th. I will think about that.
Whatever,
And see
yeah,
it may
sure.
be unavoidable. We'll see what we need to do there.
Or thereafter, whatever works. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that update. All right, then with that, please do plan to log off and log back into the Zoom, and I will see you at 1:15. Thank you.